Well, Romans. The goal this week is not really to cover all of Paul's letter to the Romans. Our goal is to have a look at maybe just the first 8 chapters this week, and then chapter 9 in the exhortation, and throw in a few of the exhortations at the end as we go along. But what I'd really like you to be able to do is to pick up the strategy and the theme as Paul's going through Romans, and it's a great letter. So the goal this week is to understand Paul's strategy in writing the letter. That's what I would really like everybody to go away with. I think it helps us remember what's in the letter, and then we'll look at the exhortations that flow from this as Paul develops those. But we only have time to hit those highlights. The ecclesia in Rome, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the background, but a couple of the key things we need to have straight about the Roman ecclesia is that they had 2 different cultures. And this is fun because you get to see in the New Testament how you bring cultures together in the Christadelphian community. And we go with this all the time. We have different cultures. Sometimes it's older and younger cultures. Sometimes it's somebody moved in from a different ecclesia and they have a different culture. But what you're going to get to see is how Paul blends 2 cultures together in those exhortations in chapters 13 and 14 and how he deals with that. And I think he gives us very practical advice for how to blend cultures. It's not that one is right and the others are wrong. His strategy you're going to see is that he says, if you want to keep your culture, go ahead and keep it, but don't force it on the other group. And if it works for you and it's developing the righteousness of faith in you, then you Jews, go ahead and do it. But don't make these Gentiles do that. But if you want to do it, go ahead. So these Roman Gentiles, you got ecclesia in Rome. And the Roman people, they would have grown up with this national spirit of Rome. They were the Roman Empire, right? And you see that in Christadelphians today, Americans versus Canadians and Australians and New Zealanders. There's always this little bit of spirit of rivalry that's there. And here it would have been intense because the Roman Gentiles felt they were totally superior to everybody else in the world. And the Roman Jews felt they were the special people of God. And both groups feel they're better than the other one. And what Paul is going to do is give us the best exposition of the atonement you'll ever find in the Bible. And he starts out and just says, neither one of you are any good. That's the beginning of Romans 1 and 2. Neither group is any good. Because without God in our lives, none of us are good. Same thing Jesus said, that, don't call me good, but it's only one that's good, and that's God our Father. So Paul's strategy in understanding the atonement is to first of all start from a perspective of humility. If we don't have that humility spirit, when we enter into a study of the atonement, we will never get it. We'll constantly argue about details and things that come up, and we miss the fact that from the beginning, we're all down there at level 0. And none of us deserve to be saved. None of us are really good people. It's all about God and what God has done in our lives. And this is going to come out in this letter over and over again. So the great thing I like about Paul's letter to the Romans is, as opposed to Hebrews, which I think he wrote as well, but in the book of Romans, if you ever want to understand the atonement, especially to the younger ones that are coming up today, if you want to understand the atonement, don't start in the Old Testament. Don't start in Hebrews, start in Romans. Because in the letter to the Romans, Paul sets out the clearest, most fundamental doctrine of the atonement. There's nothing to argue with here in his exposition of the atonement. And he doesn't couch it in flag words that we use today. Like, I imagine if most of you were asked to describe the atonement, right away we would say something about the sacrifice of Christ. Do you know those words aren't in Romans 1 to 8? He doesn't use flag words like that. He doesn't talk about sacrifices. He doesn't talk about offerings because he wants to make it totally clear what he's talking about. He's not talking about the shadows and the rituals. He's talking about the reality of what did God do through Jesus Christ, his son. That's what Paul wants to get across. So if you want to understand the atonement, start in Romans because Romans explains it without the language of the law. It's just a very clear, direct exposition of what God actually accomplished through Jesus Christ. Because you're hearing Christadelphians today talking about how, Jesus needed a sacrifice. He was born with our nature and he had to have a sacrifice. Like, where is that in Romans? It's not there. Because that's taking the language of the law and superimposing it on Jesus Christ, instead of realizing Jesus Christ was the reality that shadowed all those things in the law. And that's the perspective. As Christadelphians, we've got to get that right, or we will nitpick the atonement until the day we die, and we'll argue about all these details and miss what it was really all about. It was about God and our lives and changing how we live. That's what this is really about. So that's what we want to do this week. And here's the problem with the rituals of the law. You look at these rituals, and it's all about the shadows and how they cast a shadow. And it's all about your perspective. If you're on one side here, it looks like, oh, there's an older fellow with a cane. The same exact reality casts an entirely different shadow depending upon how you see it. And that is a problem. And you'll see that in our community as well. You take, just for example, take animal sacrifice. And you listen to people give exhortations and expositions about animal sacrifice. And here you are as a Jew, you're bringing up, and you've got your animal that you're going to bring, your goat or your lamb, and you bring it up to the priest, and you got to make sure it's without blemish. You got to make sure when you cut it open, you check the inside, and you lay your hands on the animal, and you kill the animal. And we have brethren that give expositions on this, that's teaching you that sinners deserve to die. Where is that in the New Testament? Whoever, and you look at Paul's writings, Peter's writings, Jesus' statements, whoever develops that as being the lesson of the shadow of animal sacrifice. Instead, it's all about that Christ has set an example for you that you will follow in his steps. It's not a passive thing about you deserve to die. You got to remember, who did the animal represent? It's not me, it's Jesus Christ. And I'm committing to lay my hands on the animal and die with him to sin. That's going to be Romans 6. See, Paul explains all that without the language of the law. And then you can go back to the law and figure out what God was trying to show through the rituals. It's totally backwards when we build our case from the law. And the problem is, which one has the power to change your life? All those rituals or the reality of what Christ has done for us? And as you're going to see as we go through Romans, that Paul develops the atonement in such a way that it has to change how you live. You cannot walk out of here with an understanding of the true doctrine of the atonement and think that we can continue to live in ways of this world. It's going to change how you treat people, how you treat your spouse, how you treat your children, how you treat people in ecclesial life, at business meetings and arranging meetings. It changes how you live because you understand what God did in Jesus Christ and how he's trying to replicate that in us. That has power to change our life. The nice thing about the Roman ecclesia is we don't seem to see that there's any personal issues in the letter that Paul's dealing with. He did want to visit. That comes up in chapter 1 and later on again in chapter 16, but he hadn't yet, and he just says God hadn't allowed him at this point. And if you're interested in some of that background, it was probably written on the third missionary journey, probably when he was in Acts 20, collecting the money for the Jerusalem Poor Fund. Probably. But I'm going to go through those pretty quick because I don't want to spend a lot of time on background. I want to get us into the meat of what this letter is really all about. There's actually some of the information about why people suggest that it was written at that time. You can just look at Timothy, Sopater, Gaius. They're also there collecting money for the Jerusalem Poor Fund in Acts chapter 20. And you can trace through some of these other people and see the connections. But we do know that the Roman ecclesia had Gentiles. That comes up pretty clearly in various chapters. You'll see he actually talks about the Gentiles and mentions among all nations quite often. You'll see him actually call out the Gentiles in chapter 11 there in a couple of those places. But the Roman ecclesia also had Jews. And so Paul is going to have to deal with both of these groups and give them an exposition of the atonement, which he feels in the end will motivate them to realize, I'm no better than any of you. We ought to be working together. And that's what he's after in all of this. And all appreciation for what God has done. That's what he's trying to accomplish in this letter. So look at chapter 1. We'll start out in the beginning and work our way through. I'll throw the passages up there because I'm going to be using the New King James Version, and I'll show you some of the little suggestions about how to fix those up. But he starts out as Paul. He's a slave of Jesus Christ, a bondservant, called to be an apostle, but he's separated to the gospel of God. Now, this is a key in this letter. He's going to try to explain the power of the good news of God in your life. God is entering into your life. He's willing to take human people who don't deserve his salvation, and he's willing to come into your life and be a part of you and offer to change your life and offer you this salvation that he promised before through the prophets and the Holy Scriptures concerning his Son. Now, the best Greek texts don't have Jesus Christ there. Probably a lot of your versions do. The modern versions, some of them have taken it out because he's not stressing Jesus Christ yet. He wants you to still realize it's all about God. This is what God has done through his Son. And that's the way he begins this letter. And he mentions about his Son that it was born of the seed of David according to the flesh. And we know that Jesus had to have our nature. That was critical for him to be the one who could put sin to death. And he declared to be the Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness and by resurrection from the dead. And that's when Jesus Christ our Lord is actually there in the Greek text. Through him we've received grace and apostleship for obedience to the faith. Now, most of your versions probably say that, although the NIV has correctly to the obedience that comes from faith. Now, you see what Paul's going to try to do here? All of Romans is about faith. He's going to try to illustrate to people how faith is more powerful than any law could ever be to change how you live. And how God was always after, whether it was through the laws and the rituals of the law, or whether it was now through Jesus Christ and the law being passed, God was always after only one way to save anybody, and that was by faith. And what that faith should do, when you have the faith of Jesus, it motivates us to respond to God, to trust what God brings into our life, to still treat people kindly and justly and with mercy, no matter what has happened, like Jesus did his entire life, and especially during the crucifixion. The faith of Jesus changes how you live, and it brings about an obedience to God. Not obedience to law, obedience to God. That's what he's after, and it's among all nations, not just Jews, but among all the nations for his name, among whom you are also called in Jesus Christ, or called of Christ. So that's the stress he lays out from the beginning. This is going to be about the gospel of God. Now, this is not that it's God's gospel, although that's how you could read it. But I really think that what he's trying to stress is the way this is used in Isaiah and the prophets. It's the good news of God. God is going to be involved in your life. And he's going to do something for you that could never be done in any other way. This is the power of the gospel of God, the good news of God. It also involves his Son because Jesus had a part to play. But it's going to be the power of God to salvation. He's going to say in verse 16, to everyone who has faith. That's that word believes. They throw it in our translations, and it sometimes mistakenly clouds us to think that it's something different, but it's faith. It's that Greek word for faith. And what it's going to do in verse 17 is reveal the righteousness of God. That is, Jesus is going to declare in his whole life, in this gospel that Paul's going to explain, this good news of God is going to tell everybody God's always been right, and he still is right. God is right. He's right to have condemned our race to death. He'll get to that in chapter 5. And require us to die to sin in chapter 6. He's also right because he's come up with a righteous method to take all of us who are ungodly sinners and justify us. He came up with a plan. Not us. Not about something we do. He came up with the plan because he loved you. This is the good news of God. And this is the message that the churches had wrong, the Jews had wrong, all these different groups, the pagans, they always thought there's God way off there and this righteous God. He's all angry at all of us because we're all a bunch of sinners. And Paul's going to turn this totally up on end and say, wait a minute, God loves you. He's the one who set out to save you. He's the one who cared about you. And if he hadn't done that, we would all be lost. That's the good news of God, about the righteousness of God. He's come up with a way to righteously forgive the sins of those who, as Deb pointed out yesterday in the exhortation, are involved in the war against sin. That's what God's after. He's like the greatest coach of all times, and he wants you to join his team, or his family, as Paul would say, But he's got some game plan that he's going to work out, and you have to abide by the game plan. You have to buy into it and believe he's right. And when you do, Paul's going to bring out that this is what will bring about our salvation, and this is how God can look at us as sinners and say, I don't see the sins. I see righteousness. I see my character in you, and this was God's way of saving. You see this echoed back from Isaiah 52 and so many other places where Isaiah, this is why Isaiah is quoted so often in the New Testament, because he explained the good news of God. Isaiah is quoted extensively by Jesus. He understood it was all about the good news to tell Zion that your God reigns. He's there in your midst. He's with you. Or as he ends up in verse 10, that all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. It was always about God's salvation. As we looked at in the exhortation yesterday, when the Egyptians all perished, it was that God could save. Not people who deserved it, not people who really should have got it, but people he was willing, because of promises to the fathers, he's willing to send his angels and work in your life and save you into his family. Not because we're any better than anybody else, but because of the kindness of God. That's the gospel concerning his son, that he was born according to the flesh. We know of the seed of David. He was declared to be the Son of God by the Spirit of God working in his life with power and holiness in his resurrection from the dead. That's why it was so critical in 1 Corinthians 15 that if Christ has not been raised from the dead, our faith is in vain. This was God's proof that this man, Jesus Christ, had declared the righteousness of God. And it's through Jesus that Paul had received this grace and apostleship. But the goal of all of this that you want to walk out with today, the goal is that we develop this faith that leads to obedience, and that it can go amongst all these nations. John Carter, in his book, what he described it as, he took that phrase there and he said that obedience springing from faith might be rendered by some among all nations to Christ's glory. Because he realized that's what this is all about. It's not obedience to the Christadelphian faith. That's not what he's getting at here, or to some kind of set of doctrines. This is an obedience that springs from faith. Like Abraham being willing to offer up Isaac and totally believing that God would have to resurrect Isaac from the dead. This is an obedience that comes from a faith that motivates us to do the unthinkable. We get involved in people's lives. We help out other people because we trust God is working in our lives. This is what he's after, the obedience that comes from faith, not an obedience from law. And then Paul has this section in chapter 1 that we looked at. It was very similar. I was listening to Brother Roger this morning, but all the different things that he thanks God. He talks about the faith of these people and how he makes mention of them. You'll notice in verse 9, he does that because the Romans were a bit put off by the fact that, hey, Paul, you haven't come to see us. And so Paul mentions in chapter 1 and chapter 16 that, well, that's because God just hasn't yet opened that door. But it's not because he didn't care about them and he didn't love them. But you can see that he wants to come to see them in verse 10, that he might find a way through the will of God to come to you, because he longs to see them, that he might impart some spiritual gift and be established and so on, and that it would be a mutual encouragement, that he could be encouraged by them. This is Paul understanding that in his humility that, I'm no better than you. I need encouragement. You need encouragement, and we can both encourage each other together. And he points out he had been prevented so far in verse 13, but he's under obligation because of the mission that Christ had given him back on that road to Damascus when Jesus Christ separated him out, and then he went into Arabia. He taught him the gospel, the good news, and his goal was to preach it throughout the world and even to those that were in Rome. Now, for those of you that have written essays and have to write thesis statements and all that kind of stuff, well, there it is. Paul's thesis statement that he's going to cover through this whole book of Romans is going to be this gospel of God and the power that it has for salvation. So he says in verse 16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. All right? It should be just the gospel, because the words of Christ are not in the better Greek text. The gospel, it has the power of God for salvation. I like the RSV they put in there, to everyone who has faith. See, it's not just believe, because sometimes we think, we believe. But Paul's talking about a faith that changes how you live. This is the good news of God in your life, changing how you live. For in it the righteousness of God, that's going to be God's righteous way to justify sinners. As Paul's going to explain when he gives his exposition of the atonement, he's going to show how God came up with a way to justify ungodly sinners through faith. And it's always been that way. There never was any other way to save anyone. Everyone was saved by faith, including Jesus Christ. And he quotes that passage from Habakkuk, that he who through faith is righteous shall live, or as a lot of your versions have, that the just will live by faith. See, that's what Paul, he uses that at least 3 times, and when he quotes that. The power of God, for those of you that want to look in 1 Corinthians 1, you're pretty familiar with that. He mentions how the message of the cross, it's the power of God to those that are being saved, and how it has a power to change your life. It's one of the sad things, in a sense, in the Christadelphian community that we've gotten so far away from the cross, and that God originally gave that like an emoji, so that when you looked at Jesus Christ on the cross, you would see, like the serpent on the pole, you would see sin crucified. You'd see a man who surrendered to the will of God, and that was supposed to have a power to change our life. Not in some mystical, supernatural way that people take crosses around today, but it was supposed to be, the message of the cross was supposed to be something that could have a power to change how we live. And it was the wisdom of God that would do that. But when Paul uses that phrase, the just will live by faith, that's coming out of Habakkuk chapter 2. He quotes it in Romans 1, Galatians 3, and Hebrews 10. His 3 expositions of the atonement and why salvation by faith is more powerful than the law. But he uses it in different ways. In this case, it's the righteousness of God is revealed. In Galatians 3, he's stressing nobody can be justified by works of the Jewish law. And in Hebrews 10, that whole section starts in chapter 10 about how you need endurance. You need endurance like these people did in Habakkuk's day, because rough times are coming. And so then he goes on to chapter 11 and illustrates all those people who lived still having their faith when they died. That's how the NIV puts it. Because that's what he wants to show, is that they endured to the end. They had that faith to the end. And then in chapter 12, of course, the greatest example of faith, Jesus Christ. And that's how he ends that section. But Habakkuk 2 provides a great historical section because it illustrates how faith is supposed to spring to obedience, even in the worst situations, no matter how bad things get. Here are the Babylonians coming down. They've surrounded the city of Jerusalem. There's nowhere to go. And the Jewish cultural element is saying, we've got to stay here and protect. God's going to save his city. He can't let us fall. We have the temple. We have the ark. We have all these things. And they thought there's no way they could fail. And Jeremiah goes out and tells everybody, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by the armies, same thing Jesus said, get out. Surrender. If you surrender, I'll give you your life up in Babylon. I'll let you have families. You can plant your crops. You can build homes up there, and then I'll bring your descendants back after 70 years. But you realize the faith that took to believe that? Look what happened when Jeremiah went to go out and investigate his land. The land that he had bought when God told him to go buy that land from his uncle. And right away they grabbed him at the gate and said, you're a deserter. It's treason. You're a traitor. To leave Jerusalem at that time meant leaving the culture behind and just trusting that God was right. This is a faith that springs, an obedience that springs from faith, where we trust God, we believe he's right, and we put up with all the things that happen in this life because we know that in everything God is working for good. Or as you're probably familiar with it, that in all things God works together for good. That those who love God. Paul's going to bring that up in Romans 8, in that critical final section. He's going to pull it all together because that's what faith does. It convinces us that no matter what's going on in your life, God is working for good. We just sometimes can't see it. So the leap of faith, the obedience that springs from faith, was to get out of Jerusalem. And now to these Jews, it was going to be, you're going to have to leave behind your law, all your trust in your law. Same message as Hebrews 10, actually. So the wrath of God at the end of chapter 1 is revealed against because of all the failures of the Gentiles. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that at the end of chapter 1, other than to make sure we get the strategy right. After he illustrates where he's headed and explaining God's righteousness and this salvation by faith, Paul immediately throws the Gentiles to the ground, throws them under the bus, and says, look at, none of you were ever able to attain to the righteousness of God. Nobody was able to. Look at your past history. Look what happened when God worked with the world. Look what people did. By the time you get to Genesis 6, God's got to wipe them all out with a flood. And then he works with Noah and tries to rebuild a family. And then you get to Genesis 11, and already they're building a tower to get up to heaven, and they got to change the languages. One chapter later, things are so bad, God says, the whole world's gone. I'm going to pick Abraham, and I'll work with him and his family, and we'll have a family together. And God gets very selective and tries a different strategy. See, the Gentiles had continuously failed. They failed, and they suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. They're without excuse, Paul says. They knew God. Sure, there was evidence. Look at the creation at large. You look out there and wonder, how can people possibly believe there's no God? But if you want to make up some way of doing that, and you want to go through your life and be an atheist and just have no responsibility to a creator, you can make up reasons for all the things you see. But Paul says they were without excuse. And so God gave them up in verse 24. He gave them up in verse 26. And in verse 28, he gave them up to their way of life because God had tried to work with these Gentiles and could not do it until Jesus Christ came. That's the difference in the New Testament. And you can see that if we don't appreciate that, if we don't appreciate what God has given us, the wrath of God will come upon the sons, the children of disobedience. And it's a warning to all of us. Look at the evidence that they had in just the natural creation. I look at that today. I taught biology for 20 years in AP biology, and you look at all the intricate detail that's there in just cellular biology. Or look at how our bodies function. Look at your ability to adapt here in Denver. When you come up here to the high altitude, and initially you get here and you feel like you're not doing so great maybe at high altitude, but if you spend time here, God didn't just make us so we could survive. He made us adaptable so we could survive in different scenarios. And you would start producing more red blood cells so you could survive in this low oxygen environment. That takes design. That's like the fellas trying to design auto-driving cars today. And look at all the work to get that technology to work. That's what he's done in our creation. The evidence is there. People just turn their backs. Now, if you had been reading this letter as a Jew, so, here you are, you're a good Jew. Ken's a good Jew, and he's reading this letter, and he's reading all these things about the Gentiles. God gave them up. They were filthy. They were debased mind. Look at all the things they did. They worshiped these reptiles. And he's sitting there thinking, yeah, put these Gentiles down. Yeah, we know the Jews are better. All right? That's how the Jews ended chapter 1. So then when you get to chapter 2, he brings the hammer down on the Jews. And he said, you thought you were better? You're worse! Because you had the law. You had God working with you. You had the fathers, the promise. You had all of this going for you. And what did you do? You just sit there and judged all those Gentiles, and you wrote them all off when you yourself were doing the same things. You're worse. You're more responsible to God because you knew better. So that's what he's going to do in chapter 2. And you can see how he lays, the strategy was awesome. Because this would have just banged on the Jews, and there's no way they would have missed this. So the problem in chapter 2 that he's going to develop with the Jews is that when we are of a mindset, brethren and sisters, to look around our community and judge other people, if that's our mindset, we're always looking at what somebody else does wrong. What we're doing is we're starting to say, well, I'm better than them. I haven't done that. And this can be a mindset. The Jews got into this mindset. They were constantly looking around, judging each other. And it's a warning because we're more like the Jews than we are the Gentiles. This is a natural tendency amongst us. We know what the Bible says. We realize what we're supposed to do. And we look at somebody else's life and we can judge what they're doing wrong. And Paul's going to say, when you do that, you're admitting to God you know what is right. And now you are even more accountable maybe than that other person. That's a warning that we don't want to get into that mindset of judging other people. Now, does that come up later on in Romans? Do you remember any chapters at the end? Chapter 14? See, what Paul's doing is laying all the basis for this and then say, wait a minute, don't judge somebody on the day of the week, whether they keep the Sabbath or not. Don't judge people on how they're getting dressed. Don't judge people on all this stuff, because that's not the important stuff. Let them have their culture, but don't judge people for those things. Instead, get your act together. And that's what's going to come across in Romans over and over and over again. So, chapter 2, here's where he goes. Therefore, you are inexcusable, O man, whoever you are. And this is where he's going to focus in on the Jews who judge. For in whatever you judge, from whenever you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things. But we know that the judgment of God is according to truth. See, this is what Paul's going to lay out, is that God doesn't show partiality. He doesn't judge one group of us in one way and another group a different way. The same basis of judgment for everybody. It's according to his truth against those who practice such things. And what do you think this, oh man? You who judge those who practice such things, doing the same, that you will escape the judgment of God? Are you to despise the riches of his goodness and forbearance and long-suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leads you to repentance? See, what can happen, brethren and sisters, we look across people's lives, and we find out that some young person in our community has committed premarital sex. And we sit there and we think, our immediate reaction is, how come their parents didn't fix that? And what's wrong with that young person? And we immediately go into that mode of judging people. And we don't realize that, what about us? What about all of us and all the people who think about doing things? Maybe don't do it, but we think about those things. And we play around with those things in our mind. And Paul's going to try to illustrate that don't harshly judge other people that are trying when they make mistakes, because we're no better than them. We aren't. Now, if we think we are, we're never going to get Romans. You won't understand it. You got to start with that basis. We are no better. The only thing that can possibly make us any good in God's eyes is what he has done in us. It's all about him. And he's working with those young people just like he's working with us. And he'll figure out a way to bring in the right consequences into their life. That's what angels do. We don't have to be that mindset to be judging all the time. Or maybe he brings that scenario into our ecclesia so that we're going to learn how to show mercy like God does. You ever thought of that when people make big mistakes? Somebody commits adultery. Somebody gets divorced and they remarry. And our immediate reaction is to judge. But have you ever turned it around and thought about, maybe God is trying to teach me how to be a more merciful person? See, it's a totally different way of looking at life. But raising children convinced me of that, because children make a lot of mistakes. And yet, look at how freely we forgive our children. But then do that to somebody else's children. Oh, that's tougher, isn't it? It's a lot easier to forgive your own than it is somebody else's. But see, God's letting you practice with your own family so that you can expand that out to the ecclesial family. That's what he's trying to do. It's a great game plan as to how he's designed the families. So, we're not any better. When we practice those things, we're actually more responsible, and God holds us to those. So be careful. It leaves us without excuse, because we know when we judge somebody else and we say that's wrong, we're telling God, I know it. I know that's wrong for me, and we shouldn't be practicing those things either. And it's possible that when we do, it leaves us more guilty than the other people who maybe didn't even realize to what extent it was wrong. That's the same argument Jesus uses in John 9 when he talks about, you say you see now, and therefore you're guilty because you claim to see, and you're therefore more accountable. So that's a warning to all of us. The Jews, though, they thought they were the only good people worth saving, right? That's what they thought. And as Christadelphians, we can follow and fall into this same trap of thinking that, look at all the people we passed on the way here. God's not saving them right now. We're the special people, right? We're the only ones worth saving, right? I can remember growing up as a young person having that perspective. That's the feeling I got listening to so many of the classes and talks. And then you look in the scriptures and you find out, wait a minute, that isn't really how it works. That's actually what Romans 9 is all about. Nobody's worth saving. It's all about what God chooses to do. And thank God he has chosen us. But it doesn't make us feel special. The only way in which we are special is that God considers us special. Not that we are special people, but he sees us as special because we are his family. But you look at how Amos tried to point out that God only knew the Jews of all the families of the earth. Therefore, he will punish them for their iniquities. The greater the amount of knowledge and responsibility, the greater the judgment that falls on those people. And we know a lot, brothers and sisters. We know what we're supposed to do. In John 9, Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say we see, and therefore your sin remains. So Paul's trying to remind them about this same issue. And that God's righteous judgment is individual. See, the Jews thought, when they read the Old Testament, a lot of the Old Testament passages in Deuteronomy and some of those things that God said about the nation, they were national things because he was controlling a nation that had come out of Egypt. And so he wrote national things about how the nation would develop. So as a nation, if you do what is right, that God will bless you. It was never about individuals. That's a mistake that we can make. You have to differentiate between the individual and the national promises that Israel got. And the Jews' mistake was that they read all those national things and they took them individually. And we can make that same mistake, brothers and sisters. So we look at somebody's family that has a tragedy, a child dies, or somebody in a family, a young person gets cancer. And we look at that family and we think, oh, wow, God's really getting after them for the mistakes that they made. And we don't realize that, wait a minute. God may be using them like he used Job to correct mistakes that we have. And we're supposed to be learning that. And this is the kind of thing that Paul just turns everything around and says, look at it from God's perspective. See it from God's way, and you'll finally get it as to how it really works. But these people were without excuse. The judgment is going to be according to truth, and really God's righteous judgment is going to be individual and based upon our deeds. It's not about what ecclesia you belong to. It's not about what family you grew up in. It's not about who your spouse is. It's about how have you done developing the faith of Jesus that will spring to obedience to God. That's what he's going to look at us about. That's what matters. So he'll deal with that later on in chapter 6 when he talks about slavery to sin versus slavery to God. So in chapter 2 at verse 5, he goes on, then in accordance with the hardness of your impenitent heart, you're treasuring up for yourself wrath in the day of wrath and the revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to each one according to his deeds. See, not nationality. No, this is going to be individually. Eternal life to those who by patient continuance in doing good, they seek for glory and honor and immortality. But to those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, indignation and wrath and tribulation and anguish on every soul of man who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek. But glory and honor and peace to everyone who works what is good. Right? This is what he's after, this response that we will give God because of what God has done for us. To the Jew first and also to the Greek, for there is no partiality with God. See, that issue of partiality is something that was a real problem in the first century ecclesia, and it still can be today. That God shows partiality to us based upon our family backgrounds or what ecclesia we belong to and so on. It isn't true. There is no partiality with God. It's all about how are we doing individually and applying these things and putting them into practice. How is our faith growing, brothers and sisters? It's something we should pray about every day. Pray that God will increase our faith. That is the only thing that really matters. Because as our faith grows, we will inevitably respond to that by becoming more involved in God's family. You can't walk away from the ecclesia when you have the faith of Jesus. You can't. Even when people mistreat you. Some of you probably wonder, how did Joseph ever love his brothers when they did all those things to him? He had the faith of Jesus. It didn't matter what people said to him, what they did to him, how they mistreated him. He trusted God, that all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. This faith has power to change how you live. You won't yell at people anymore. You don't get as angry at people anymore. You learn to treat people with love and kindness, and you care about them. Instead of when something goes wrong, you jump in and say, what can you do to help? Not, how can I judge you and wish that you were out of the ecclesia or something like that. See, that's what God's atonement will do to you because, as Paul is going to develop, that's what God did for you. How can you not do it for the others? This is what the atonement was really all about. It's not something to argue. It's not something to debate. It is something to live. And that's what God was hoping for. So that's what he's after right here. It's going to be individual. So God doesn't really, as the Jews thought, he doesn't go through our life and decide, well, today, how are you doing on good things and how are you doing on bad things? And as long as your good things outweigh your bad things, you're righteous. That isn't how it works with God. What God does is he looks to see if we're really seeking him, if we have the faith that will lead to obedience, if we trust God in every way, and he can then overlook the mistakes and count our faith as righteousness. This is God's righteousness. We use that phrase all the time in our community, the righteousness of God. But when Paul uses it here in Romans, he's talking about God's righteous way to forgive sinners. And he's looking for this kind of faith. It's a faith that generates obedience to God. Not obedience based on, I want to look good for God. I want to do all this stuff right. I'm going to go to Bible school, and I'm going to give the classes there, and I'm going to go out and help the people, and I'm going to pick up the trash. I'm going to do it so I can go to God and say, look at all the good things I did today. That isn't what this faith is about. This is a faith that trusts God in everything. You jump in and get involved because you are so thankful for what God has done. There's no spirit of looking good before God. You just look at Jesus. You never see that in him. Look at his focus all the time. He's always focused on saving the many. That's what got him through it. That's how God saved him. It wasn't about a selfish salvation that I want to be saved. It was about trusting God, whatever happened, and just working in God's family and trying to save the many. That's what God is really after in our lives as well. So, at the end of chapter 2, look at how Paul gets into this, looking at the Jewish problem. For as many have sinned without the law, that would be the Gentiles, will also perish without the law. That's these Gentiles. And as many as sinned in the law, the Jews, you will be judged by the law. See, that's a difference. A lot of these Gentiles out there, they perish without God's law, and they just perish. They're gone. But oh no, that's not true of us. We will be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law. Sound like James? Right? The doers of the law will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature, this is this new nature, this new man that's being created, the new creature that God is developing in these Gentiles, when they do the things, the very things that are in the law, these principles that the law was trying to get us to see, although not having the law, they're a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts. Not on tables of stone, but in their hearts. This is what God was always after. And their conscience, not the law, but their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. See, this is what Paul is after, that these people would, in their hearts, they would be living the truth because of what God has done for them. You see this in 2 Corinthians 5, where Paul points out the love of Christ compels us, because we judge thus that if one died for all, then all died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and rose again. See, this response that God is after, when we have this faith of believing that we identify with Jesus Christ and we lay our hands on him and we are buried with him in his death to sin, then we respond by living no longer for ourselves, but for him who died for us and rose again. So God's righteousness is going to be to those who sin without the law, the Gentiles, and also to those that would be in the law. And the Gentiles, when it talks about them doing by nature, I really believe, as John Carter said, it's the new nature that God was developing in them, that God's law would be in their hearts. That's what God was after, and it affects their consciences and their thoughts. That one day God will judge the secrets of these Gentiles by Jesus Christ. One standard for all. Everybody's going to be judged on the basis of, did you operate on faith or didn't you? That's what God is after. If you have that kind of faith, and that's what was operating in your life, then God sees you as one of his children and counts you as righteous. So he goes on to the Jews then and says, okay, you Jews, indeed, you're called a Jew. You rest on your law. You make your boast in God. God's chosen us. We're the special people. You know his will and approve the things that are excellent. As you're reading through this, brothers and sisters, we've got to be careful because this is why it would come across to us. If Paul is here talking to us today, that's what he would say. Look at you. You rest on the law. You got your Bibles, right? You know all these things. You make your boast in God. You know his will. Approve of things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind and a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish and a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and truth in the law. You therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? This is where the message becomes personal. We have to be doing this. It's not good enough to give seminars and tell everybody else how they should live. We have to be walking the walk. You have to be walking in the light. So you preach that a man should not steal. Well, do you steal? Because the Jews were doing that in the temples, taking advantage of some of the Gentile things. You who say, do not commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? Oh, maybe you don't do it physically, but do you do it in your mind? Do you think about it? You're no better than the guy who did it. We both have a problem. We both got to work on what we've done wrong. You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. And he quotes that passage from Exodus 36 there about the Jews blaspheming God's name. So be careful. We have been given so much, brothers and sisters. We really have. We have been given an understanding of the truth. We've been given ecclesias, communities. We have angels that work for us. God is working in our families. But don't ever take it for granted, and don't think it's because we're better people than other people. It's only about the fact that God, in his kindness and his mercy, has extended his truth to us. So when we think we're guiding the blind, let's be careful that we're not making those same mistakes that we judge other people for and full of self-confidence. These Jews were really good at preaching, but not so good at doing. And you can be here at this Bible school this week, and we can get all these good things into our hearts, and we can feel really good while we're here. We can treat everybody really nice. I can treat my spouse really good this week while we're here. We can look really good before everybody else. But what happens when you go home? What happens when you get back to your own ecclesia, to your own house? How do you treat people then? How do you deal with folks in the ecclesia that don't agree with you? How do you deal with your children, your family? Do you yell and scream at them? Is that what we do? Do we scheme around people so that we can get our way? See, this is where the atonement comes into changing your life. It has to have a power. It's the power of the cross. These Jews, they relied on all their good-looking legal status things, the rituals they had, God's special people. They got the law. They got the temple. They've got the priesthood. They've got circumcision. They had all the rituals. But see, those things were privileges, not entitlements. That didn't make them a better person. It gave them the opportunity to learn about faith in Jesus Christ. And that's the great warning that we have for ourselves today. So as Paul ends this up, he says, for circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law, but if you're a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. In other words, in their hearts. You might be a circumcised male down there, but in your heart, you're uncircumcised. You're not living it. And what good was it to have the physical circumcision if you didn't live it? Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law, here's a Gentile over here, uncircumcised, but he's living out the righteousness of God. The very things the law had foreshadowed and tried to get you to do. If that's the case, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? And will not the physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, judge you, who even with your written code and circumcision are transgressors of the law? For he who is not a Jew who is one outwardly, and nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God. That's the thing that Paul is really after here. So you can see that's a pretty clear section there. That's what he was really after. But I just wanted to show you how in Romans 12, when he finally gets to chapter 12, and he gives all those exhortational things, look at how that is built on these early chapters of Romans. I used to think Paul just threw in all these exhortations at the end of Romans 12, sort of like separate from the rest of the letter, but they're actually built on his exposition of the atonement. If you really understand and implement chapters 1 and 2, then how can you not use this faith that you've got to help other people and to not look at ourselves as more highly than we ought to look, but appreciate all the rest of the community? And it changes then how you treat these people. That's what Paul will do in Romans 12. So this morning, let's go away convinced salvation is all of God, and thank God for his mercy and his loving kindness. Let's make sure we develop the faith that leads to obedience. It springs to obedience because we trust God like Jesus Christ did. And remember, it does matter that we believe that our understanding of the atonement changes how we live. We've got to get this right because this is the power of God operating in us. And understanding the gospel of God makes us humble because we've all failed and we don't deserve God's mercy. Nobody here deserves it. It's all about God's kindness. And so be kind and merciful to others. See, this is what will flow from this. When you really believe I don't deserve this, and God has been merciful to me and showed me unbelievable kindness, then how can we not show that to one another? How can we do that? How can we go to meeting on a Sunday and remember in the sacrifice of Christ, we take those emblems and then we go home and mistreat people? We haven't really taken the atonement to heart, brothers and sisters. This will change how you live. And so you can monitor that by how you behave in the days to come. And if you don't get it right and you're failing in the power to change your life, go back and read it and pray for understanding because it will change how you live.